So good morning, everybody. It's such a great pleasure to have you all here. And before starting with my brief remarks, following the protocol of the Getúlio Vargas Foundation, I have some disclaimers that I'm supposed to announce. So first of all statements expressed by Fundação Getúlio Vargas, employees and guests in our online events and broadcasts exclusively represent their opinions and not necessarily FGV's institutional position. We also reiterate that everyone present here agreed to participate in this event of their own free will, and they will consented to be recorded in this broadcast, which will be posted later on FGV's official channels. To continue with this transmission, we ask that you express your agreement by verbalizing or signaling your agreement. So, thank you all. And the second one. This event may collect your personal data and record your image and voice through photographs and videos in accordance with applicable laws. You have the option to refrain from participating. If you have any questions, please contact FGV through the data protection section at portal.fgv.br. Thank you all. So let's get started. So good morning, everybody. Again, it's such a great pleasure to have you all here at the seat of the São Paulo School of Economics from Getúlio Vargas Foundation. Today we have the honor to receive a highly distinguished guest and a good friend of Brazil, the Minister of Industry and Trade of Singapore, Mr. Alvin Tan. Welcome, Minister. Mr. Alvin Tan has played a pivotal role in the successful conclusion of the Mercosul-Singapore Free Trade Agreement, one of the main topics of our discussions today. The Mercosul-Singapore Agreement is the first FTA negotiated by Mercosul members with an Asian country. Singapore is Brazil's second largest export destination in Asia after China, and is a prominent source of FDI at the global level. The country is connected to nearly 90% of global GDP through an impressive network of 27 FTAs, including two of the largest trade arrangements in the world economy today, the CTPP and RCEP. These two regional agreements alone amount to nearly 47% of global GDP when the size of their economies is considered. This comprehensive network of preferential trade agreements and preferential trade partners, as a consequence, turned Singapore into a natural hub for Mercosul exports in Asia, currently the most dynamic region in the global economy. Hopefully, this agreement will be a stepping stone for the advancement and conclusion of other trade negotiations in Asia, like the ongoing negotiations, and very complex one, by the way, between Mercosul and South Korea, as well as preliminary trade talks with countries like Indonesia, Vietnam, and India. For many influential voices today, globalization has become a synonym for economic and social distress. However, taking a broader view over the last decades of hyperglobalization, the picture seems much less gloomy than many people seem to believe in. Just over the last 3 decades, nearly 1.5 billion people have been lifted out of extreme poverty, meaning that the share of global population living in extreme poverty has declined from 55% in 1981 to less than 10% today. Over the same period, developing economies have risen their share in global merchandise exports from 33% to 50%. As for their share in global GDP, it has risen from 24% to 43%. These growth rates are not less impressive when China is taken out of the sample. Despite a clear economic convergence between developing and developed economies over the last decades, income inequality has increased within several countries. In the USA, for instance, a large set of recent empirical studies have shown that trade with China is not the main culprit for job losses in the American manufacturing sector, suggesting labor-saving technological progress by far the most important factor behind it. Moreover, the tariff war between China and the United States has not contributed to bring jobs back to the USA or even to reduce bilateral trade imbalances. At the same time, and not really surprisingly, American consumers and not Chinese exporters were the ones who actually paid for the tariffs as final goods became more expensive in the American market. In spite of that, the risk of decoupling should not be underestimated. Nowadays, China alone amounts to nearly 35% of global manufacturing production, and therefore, the fragmentation of the global economy in two blocks, according to geopolitical inclinations, could cost up to 5% of global GDP in the longer term, according to the WTO. No doubt, the WTO needs reforms, and policymakers around the world could do more to fight poverty, income inequality, increase the resilience of global value chains, speed up the green transition, or even address legitimate national security concerns. However, in order to properly address those issues, we urgently need a well-functioning multilateral trading system, data-based solid guidance and technical expertise, more cooperation and coordination. We definitely don't need misleading political narratives or even the opportunistic use of trade policy as it has unfortunately become commonplace over the last years. And now, just a few words about the Center for Global Business Studies at FGV that will be launched next November on the occasion of the 4th anniversary of the book Política Comercial no Brasil, Causas e Consequências do Nosso Isolamento, written by Emanuel Ornelas, João Paulo Pessoa, and I. Those two co-authors are here present. Please, Ornelas and João Paulo, raise your hand. Thank you very much for coming. We from the Center for Global Business Studies at FGV believe that international trade is part of the solution to answer the challenges posed by globalization today. The Center will aim to play a decisive role in the current public policy debate on globalization issues, trade and investment relations among countries, promoting high-qualified discussions like the one we are going to have today, as well as fighting against misconceptions and misinformation in a fully technical and politically unbiased way. In summary, we are from the view that the global economy needs more globalization rather than less globalization. So thank you all for joining us today, and I will now give the floor to Minister Alvin Tan. Please, Minister, the floor is yours.
Tudo bem to all of you. For those of you who are here, you will have to sit through a small lecture from me, so if you are in agreement, please say yes. Usually in Singapore now what we have is, before the start, because I was talking to the incoming ambassador, at the start of any of these events, rather than saying, these disclaimers, we actually have a disclaimer about fire safety. But typically, that's something that we used at the start of everything. But I wanted to really thank now Professor Ferez and your team, of course, Luciana Mazza, who's our incoming ambassador designate to Brazil, and Larissa Washhole, who's the former special advisor for the Ministry of Agriculture in Brazil, and of course, a very distinguished gentleman, Ambassador Ruben Barbosa. And many of you who are interested in Singapore, many of you who are friends of Singapore, many familiar faces. Thank you very much for having me as well as my team here in Sao Paulo. Actually, this is our last day of my delegation's trip to Brazil, but in fact, I have been here since last week, early last week. I was here last week in Manaus, so it only took us about 36 hours to travel from Singapore all the way to Manaus. I was here for the G20 Ministerial on Science, Technology, and Innovation. And I think we had a really good discussion on areas of collaboration and the importance of research, innovation, and science amongst and between our countries, as well as the countries that represent the G20. Then after that, I went from Manaus down to Belém, the historic city of Belém in Para, I believe. And that was for the Tourism G20 Ministers meeting. So I've gotten to see that part of Brazil. But actually, this is my third time in Brazil. I first came to your beautiful, beautiful country as a student while I was studying in the United States. And I visited Manaus before, swam in the Amazon. I had all my toes intact. I swam with piranhas, but all the toes were intact. And then I visited beautiful Foz do Iguaçu, and of course Sao Paulo and Rio. So it's a pleasure to be back in your beautiful city. But let me start with my short lecture. I thought it would be very useful to articulate the importance of this bilateral relationship, why Brazil is important, and to those of you who are interested in Singapore but may not be quite yet familiar with Singapore, maybe please allow me to share a little bit about our small, tiny island. So once again, thank you to both the management and the faculty of the FGV School of Economics for having me. Again, thank you to Professor Lucas Ferres. As I mentioned, I wanted to share about Singapore's economic development journey towards innovation, growth, and also the strong potential that we see in how Brazil as well as Singapore can collaborate, not just in science and technology and tourism, but in many different areas. So I think today we'll explore all of these different areas in detail. But please allow me first to touch on Mercosul and also the significance of the Mercosul-Singapore Free Trade Agreement, which Professor Ferres had mentioned. Mercosul obviously is huge, it's large. It's also diverse, it's also vibrant. Collectively, it is the world's 5th largest economy and home to about 3 million people, majority here in Brazil. For Singapore, it's the other side of the world away. But to Singapore, Mercosul is a dynamic market with new and untapped opportunities for investment, for trade, and also for opportunities for our companies to collaborate together in areas such as the green economy as well as in digital innovation. As Mercosul's largest economy in Brazil, or in the region, Brazil continues to attract Singapore companies who are interested in this vibrant region and the opportunities that this vibrant region offers. And it is no wonder that the highest concentration of Singapore companies in Latin America, the highest concentration of Singapore companies in the whole of Latin America, is in Brazil. As many of you know, in fact, last year when my team and I were in Rio de Janeiro, we signed the Mercosul-Singapore Free Trade Agreement. It's just last December. This free trade agreement is important, it's significant, it's in fact a landmark agreement and the first comprehensive trade agreement between us. Once in force, and Professor and Ambassador were talking about whether it is now in force. It's not yet in force, but it's not so difficult, I hope, to put it in force and our businesses can use it. But once it is in force, and that means it is ratified by Singapore, at least Singapore and another country, then the FTA will establish transparent and predictable investment conditions, increase the transparency for customs procedures, and this will allow a more efficient clearance of goods and facilitate end-to-end digital trade through interoperable as well as common digital trade rules. It will also foster cooperation in many other important areas, such as the development of your micro and small enterprises, entrepreneurship and digitalization, through collaborative activities, as well as also building capability. So yesterday I was together with Shopee and Sibre, and MSME development is very important. And Shopee, which is a Singapore company, is now training, I think, about 500,000 businesses or small and medium enterprises in Brazil. So these are just examples. It's not just a trade agreement, but our businesses are doing something concrete. So I really do hope, and my team really do hope, that the FTA can be ratified quickly and brought into effect as soon as possible, because it will benefit all of our companies. The free trade agreement is also significant for both Singapore and Mercosul, because it is not just Singapore's first trade deal with a common market of the South, it is also Mercosul's first FTA with a Southeast Asian country. And it may not be so easy. I think there are other discussions with Mercosul, with other potential partners, but if you talk to Singapore, we try to do the deal quickly, we try to do it efficiently, and we want to land it as fast as possible. The FTA, therefore, is important because it establishes a clear institutional pathway for greater trade and investment, not just between Singapore and Brazil. We are thinking bigger, we are thinking further. It is actually between two dynamic regions, Southeast Asia as well as South America. Opposite sides of the world, but if you talk to many of the businesses and the governments, very similar, sometimes in terms of climate. When I was in Manaus, it felt like the jungles of Singapore. We are actually, Manaus and Singapore and Belém, if I looked at the map, it's almost the same latitude. It's almost the same latitude. So there are many similarities and complementarities between both our dynamic regions, South America and also Southeast Asia. And of course, this will generate a lot of opportunities for exchanges, for mutual learning between us, and also, most importantly, also for business opportunities. Why? Because both our regions are rapidly growing, they are large, and they're also growing middle-class populations. And that's a huge dividend that we must capture and we must treasure. Both regions are also making significant strides in terms of developing infrastructure, in terms of digitalizing, and also protecting your precious environment, sustainability. In fact, Southeast Asia is one of the world's fastest growing regions. Can I have a hand here and just see how many people have been to that other side of the world, Southeast Asia? Okay, excellent. We will get the rest of you over. Southeast Asia, I mean, many of us here grew up in Southeast Asia. It's very dynamic. I did businesses across Southeast Asia. You'll see that Singapore is very different from Thailand, from Vietnam, from Indonesia, from the Philippines. It's incredibly dynamic. Economy is worth about $3 trillion and a population about 650, 670 million. It is the world's largest, one of the world's largest and fastest growing regions. And it also continues to benefit from a demographic dividend. I mentioned about the population of over 670 million people and a median age of 30.4 years old. I'm not close to the median age, but I think if you live there, you may look a bit younger. So, but with a good demographic dividend, ASEAN does have a very young population and a growing workforce. And this workforce is not just young. They're not just idle, but they are hungry, they are sophisticated, and they are plugged into the world economy. They are one of the most connected in the world. I mentioned earlier on about ASEAN's economy. ASEAN's economy is projected to grow by another US $1 trillion in 2030. And if you put it together, it will make it the world's fourth largest economy. But like Mercosul, ASEAN also continues to push for deeper integration. ASEAN has about 10 member states, Singapore, Vietnam, Philippines, Malaysia, Indonesia, Brunei, Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar. So we have 10 member states. And we are also pushing for deeper integration between these member states. In addition to the ASEAN Trade in Goods and Agreement, which aims to achieve a free flow of goods within the region, we are also in the process of negotiating an ASEAN Digital Economy Framework Agreement, which would facilitate digital trade and allow our companies to tap into the growth of the growing and fast, rapidly evolving digital economy. We thus have in place a number of free trade agreements with dialogue partners, including Australia, New Zealand, China, India, Japan, and also the Republic of Korea. ASEAN member states are also exploring cooperation in very new domains as well as modalities. Let me share an example. One example is the ASEAN Power Grid, which seeks to ensure energy security, accessibility, and sustainability in our ASEAN region by integrating power infrastructure across the different ASEAN countries. This is quite important because it would include the establishment of cross-border power interconnections, and this will allow for the sharing of excess power capacity among ASEAN countries. So if you are a net producer of energy, particularly we're keen on clean energy, you can then export it to other countries who are energy deficient. So with Singapore, we are very proud to be the first country in Southeast Asia with a comprehensive free trade agreement with Mercosul. With Singapore, Mercosul has a trusted partner in this exciting Southeast Asian region with a strong connectivity to our region and through our region to the world. As Professor Ferres mentioned, we have a network of 27 free trade agreements in force, covering all major world economies and our largest trading partners. This network is set to grow in the near future with the entry into force of the FTA between Singapore and the Alianza del Pacífico, which is the Pacific Alliance. And of course, we look forward to the ratification of this Mercosul-Singapore Free Trade Agreement. So I've talked about more of the regional ones, but maybe I go now into the Singapore story. The Singapore story. Singapore's economic development journey is a short one, but it's a very exciting one. Next year, Singapore turns 60 years old, just 60 years old. Singapore was thrust into independence in 1965. It wasn't something that we wanted to do. It was something which was thrust upon us. At that time, we were part of the broader Malaysia region, Malaya. But circumstances meant that we were now alone, kicked out 1965. At that time, we had about 1.8 million people and no domestic industry to speak of. We, coming to Brazil, we see your vast land, we see your vast resources. We are always very envious. But in Singapore, you can put 11,000 Singapores in Brazil. It's not just 11 Singapore, 11,000 Singapores in Brazil. So we are short of land, we are short of resource, we are land and resource scarce. And so we had to rely on other countries for food, for water, for energy. For food, for water, for energy. Just imagine an island like this, no resources, no hinterland, just immediately thrust out of a larger hinterland. Then in 1965, I think many of our parents were there, we had high levels of unemployment and poverty. In fact, unemployment was about 14%, and half of our population was unable to read and unable to write. My grandparents came from China. They were unable to read, to write. They were working for the British, who were the colonial administrators in Singapore. So when my grandparents came, they were working as domestic helpers for the British. My grandfather was cleaning the toilets in, many of you may know, Raffles Hotel, a very iconic Raffles Hotel. So that was first generation. Second generation, my parents didn't go to university, and then it's third generation. So it's just 3 generations. If you think about this then, our GDP per person, GDP per capita, was about $500 US. If you fast forward about 59 years to today, it is about 82,000 GDP per capita. So 500 in 1965 to 82,000 or so in 2024. So when you were first thrust out of into independence, our first and most important priority was to create jobs. So we focused on export-led industrialization and attracted global multinational corporations to Singapore to invest in Singapore to quickly provide Singaporeans with employment and also technical skills. And I still remember my father was one of the beneficiaries because a MNC came, they trained him, they hired him, and so a lot of Singaporeans, like my parents, started to gain expertise, started to gain some confidence in building an economy. Over time, over the years and the decades, we slowly then move up the value chain. We transitioned from a labor-intensive economy to a capital and also a skills-intensive one. So we built our infrastructure, we developed our infrastructure, we built our roads, we built our metro, MRT, and we expanded our international airport. We have 4 terminals. If you come to our airport now, you'll be quite surprised because we have a waterfall in our airport. But it doesn't flood the airport, don't worry. Yeah. We are building a 5th terminal, which will be the size of our 4 airports combined. We also invested heavily in the most important thing, which is what you are doing here in education, building new schools, building new facilities for our universities. But as any country would also meet within their journey, in 1985, Singapore fell into a recession while the global economy continued to grow. It was a wake-up call for our tiny island nation, which revealed the realities of why we need to change how we structured our economy and structured our country. Because as you grow up the value chain, then the cost advantages start to wither away, and then the resource constraints just continue to be enduring. This recession was quite a turning point because it made us to rethink how do we then restructure, how do we grow our economy in a way that can be sustained for the long term. So we decided then that we needed to change course, restructure, promote innovation, enterprise, and also entrepreneurship to achieve our next phase of economic growth. It's no longer rapid industrialization, no longer low-cost, labor-intensive, but what is the next move? What is the next chapter? What is the next step? So we expanded our research and development capabilities in our universities and our research agencies, and we emphasize on translating research into economic opportunities. So it's not just research, that's important as well, but how do you quickly commercialize it? How do you make it applicable, applied? We also scaled up platforms to drive tech translation, and we supported our companies in becoming more innovative and offered them resources, and that's why Enterprise Singapore is very important. Audrey is here to help bring their products to market. Now, my friends, Singapore has been described as an improbable nation. And therefore, without us if we don't continually innovate, I think we will become irrelevant and we will disappear. Most small states in history disappear or be subsumed. So it's important for us. In this regard, it's also our reality that we cannot change. We do a lot of, we reclaim land. But you can't reclaim land so much that it joins to another country. So there's limitation to how much land we reclaim. So these constraints are real. These constraints are a reality of a small island nation. And so against the odds, Singapore's innovation ecosystem continues to grow in both the size and also dynamism. We make mistakes along the way, it's trial and error, but we have seen some success, and let me share a little bit. In 2023, the World Intellectual Property Organization, WIPO, ranked Singapore as the world's 5th most innovative economy on its annual Global Innovation Index. Our small island home is now home to over 30 unicorns, 4,500 startups, and about 400 VC firms. 80 of the world's top 100 tech companies have a presence in Singapore. And of course, all of this did not happen overnight. As I briefly mentioned, it took decades of hard work, commitment, investment. And we learned many lessons along the way. I mentioned earlier on, some of them quite costly. But we'll continue to work hard at renewing, refreshing Singapore, and keep Singapore at the forefront of innovation so that our businesses can thrive and compete, and to collaborate globally and internationally. I now move to the next part of my remarks about Singapore-Brazil partnership, basically innovative partnership. It's really exciting to see Singapore companies thriving in Brazil and doing interesting and innovative work. We met many of them over the course of this week. Of course, I also meet a lot of Brazilian companies in Singapore, and they're doing very, very well. Let me share a few examples. Last year, the CBMM from Brazil, which is a global leader in niobium products and technology, together with our National University of Singapore's Centre for Advanced 2D Materials, launched an advanced battery laboratory. This laboratory is the most high-tech and well-equipped facility in Singapore to explore new frontiers in battery technology. Together, the Centre and CBMM have developed advanced niobium graphene batteries. These batteries are quite innovative because it significantly reduces the total cost of ownership compared to existing lithium-ion batteries, which is ubiquitous in EVs now. Why? Because these new niobium graphene batteries have a longer lifespan and also super ultra-fast charging capabilities. These batteries also offer improved safety as they do not risk explosion in high temperatures. Then, that's CBMM. Then you also have Braskem. Braskem, of course, is Latin America's biggest petrochem producer and a global leader in bioplastics manufacturing. Braskem also has its Asia headquarters in Singapore. In 2021, at the height of the global COVID-19 pandemic, Braskem opened a new logistics hub in Singapore in partnership with global logistics partner AP Moller, Maersk, as well as Singapore's PSA Corporation, to reinforce its supply chain in Asia and to also address growing demand from markets such as China, India, Japan, Indonesia, and Thailand. This development followed Braskem's existing partnership with the Port of Singapore Authority, whose forward hubbing scheme has allowed Braskem to use PSA Singapore, which is the world's largest container transshipment hub, is located, as the regional distributing focal point. So these are the Brazilian companies that are doing incredible work in Singapore. But we also have examples of Singapore companies doing good work in Brazil, and I hope more to come. Some of them are here today. Let me just share quick two examples. First is C Limited, which I think many of you will be familiar with Shopee. It's a global consumer internet company founded in Singapore 2009 with a mission to better lives of consumers and small businesses with technology. C has been present and investing in Brazil since 2017 with Garena, which is a leading online games developer and publisher, and since 2019 with Shopee, its e-commerce platform, which many of us, I think, buy quite a lot of stuff from. Through Shopee's Seller Education Center, it has trained 500,000 Brazilian entrepreneurs, which I mentioned earlier, and many of them are micro and small enterprises. They do these live broadcasts. I think many of you have seen that before. And more than 500 live broadcasts are carried out every day on Shopee's app. Then you also have Profile Print. Many of you may not know, but it's a very interesting company. Profile Print is an AI-powered ingredient quality fingerprint platform. Profile Print's platform can rapidly analyze food ingredients like coffee, cocoa, and sugars in a mere matter of seconds. Profile Print's platform helps companies to optimize their production processes and also to save costs. Profile Print has signed commercial contracts with 3 of Brazil's largest food companies, Luiz Dreyfus, Olam Agricola, and Sucafina. So you see that collaboration and you see the opportunities for collaboration. Profile Print is able to help these companies address the challenge of quality assessment in Brazil's food ingredient supply chain and also to reduce these companies' carbon footprint by minimizing physical grading and also sample shipments, so that you reduce your operational costs and also efficiency, increase your efficiency. So I've shared a few examples of companies from both Brazil and Singapore which are pursuing partnerships for new cutting-edge and innovative work. And I'm sure with this incredible partnership, we'll continue to see many more. And that's why I've also led a delegation of Singapore fintech companies to Sao Paulo this week to identify potential partners and new opportunities in areas such as financial services, digital payments, and fintech regulation. Many of them are here today. You've had many very interesting meetings. You've also interacted with Brazilian fintechs, and I hope this will lead to, in fact, I'm confident that it will lead to very meaningful outcomes. In fact, when we saw them interacting yesterday, the spark of entrepreneurship and innovation is already there. So I welcome more Brazilian companies to come to Singapore and more Singapore companies to come to Brazil to strengthen this relationship. Ladies and gentlemen, we may be very different in size. Your football is much better than ours, even though I know that it hasn't been quite good for some time. Ours has never been good, period. So you are much better. And even though we are a world apart, I think there's many that we can share together, and I look forward to strengthening this relationship with all of you. Muito obrigado. Thank you.
Good morning to everyone. Welcome to Getúlio Vargas. It's a pleasure to be the moderator of the next panel. So let me invite our panelist, Ambassador Luciano Maza. That will be our first panelist. And he'll be the next ambassador in Singapore. Let me invite Larissa, Madame Larissa Valholt. It's a very complicated name. Please, Larissa now she works at the Ministry of Agriculture in Brazil, and now she is the head of a firm, Valia. And then Ambassador Rubens Barbosa, ex-ambassador of Brazil and United States, and president of IRICE, now here in Brazil. It's a pleasure to have you with us. Now, let's start. For the new ambassador of Singapore. Ambassador, tell us what are the main issues of the agreement? Because I think nobody has the opportunity to read the agreements. I think I am the only one who loves to read agreements. Can you tell us what are the main characteristics of the agreement, please?
Thank you, Vera. Thank you, Professor Lucas Ferraz, for the invitation to be here. Minister Alvin Tan. I want, first of all, thank you, Ambassador Larissa, and Minister, thank you very much for being here in Brazil, and I'll just to congratulate you and your team for this visit. And I want, first of all, I mean, at this moment, I'm in a bit of a limbo, because I'm left my previous position, but I'm not there yet in Singapore. But I would just to refer to the important contribution that Singapore is bringing to our G20 presidency. Yourself mentioned that you had this very long and challenging trip to different capitals in Brazil. I was myself in Maceió 2 weeks ago to our digital ministerial. Singapore was there, present and very active. And so on behalf of the Brazilian government, I want to thank you for being to show this commitment to our presidency. I think that's been very important to us. And Vera, I think first of all, it's important to put this agreement in context. And now, seeing this challenge of being the future ambassador in Singapore, that's the way I'm trying to look into this. I think the agreement is one indication of many elements that Mr. Tan has presented to us, of a great momentum that our bilateral relations are experiencing right now. Mr. Tan has played a very important role in making sure that we got to the finish line of this agreement, in particular the less hurdles that we had last year before getting to the end of this process. But clearly that's part of a broader picture where we have Brazil-Singapore, Mercosul as well, but I can speak more directly about Brazil and Singapore relations. Closer relations, more important relations, very dynamic relations that cover a lot of different areas of social, economic, and cultural lives. I think perhaps 20 years ago, say, well, it's being a Brazilian ambassador to Singapore, people don't really know exactly. Today is very different, and I think we see a lot of excitement about this. We see we have a lot of visitors from both sides. I speak to our colleagues at the embassy there. I know at this moment about 2 or 3 ministers that are going to Singapore, and the other direction is the same. So I think the agreement is very important to, let's say, to give a sense of permanence to this momentum, to bring certainty, to create institutional framework that will help give some direction to our relations, not only in the economic and trade side, I think for many other areas. And that I think it's one of the perhaps the biggest challenges and something that I see as an objective to pursue is to see exactly how this agreement, when it comes into force, and I think there's another chapter that we can touch upon a little bit later, how we can help to make this happen soon, is how this agreement can also foster and assist in building and strengthening our relations in other related areas. The agreement is a broad agreement. It covers areas as e-commerce, for instance, that is not something that is traditional in other agreements. E-commerce, as it is in the agreement, does not necessarily cover a lot of other digital dimensions, but is an initial step that can point to collaborations in other areas of the digital domain. Mr. Tan mentioned micro and small, medium enterprises. There's a different chapter, it's something that is new and talks about cooperation, an area that is something that I think will be important for both countries. And science, technology, innovation, that I think the relations between this agreement and how we can foster collaborations and partnerships in science, technology, innovation is something that I think will be very important to both countries. So that would be my initial comments. I know I didn't fully reply to your answer, but that would be my initial comments on this. Thank you, Vera.
I think one of the points that is important to say is that Singapore and all the region in Southeast Asia, they have the less restricted rules of origin agreement. And I can tell you because I work with a lot of my life with rules of origin, and I love, and now it's becoming a big issue now, right? And for Brazilians, it's important too, is the flexibility of rules of origin. That is one of the most important instruments to grow export. Let me go now to our lady here. Larissa, with all your knowledge that you have about agriculture, tell us how we can use, how Brazil can use Singapore as a really a big place to strengthen our exports in agriculture. Not only on traditional goods, but how about new ones, please?
Thank you. I really think that this is an area of a great potential, not only if we think about the traditional commodities that Brazil is good at exporting, but I think the agreement is very positive for at least 3 aspects. One is the fact that Singapore is a very high-income country. The minister was always just now mentioning the per capita income of Singapore at about $80,000 a year. So this is really something that could bring a huge potential to Brazilian agri-industry in general. So then we're not talking necessarily about commodities, but we're talking about products of higher value added that could actually also be exported by small and medium enterprises, which is the reality for products in the agribusiness industry that does not refer to animal protein. So obviously animal protein, those are huge companies, but except for the animal protein sector, when we talk about agri-industry, there is a plethora, a huge number of companies that could benefit, and then I'm talking about wines, like sparkling wines. I'm talking about different products made from typical Brazilian fruits, like processed fruits, juices, anything that is related to nutrition, to the well-being, which is something that Asians in general tend to put a lot of value into. And then I also get to my second point. So not only Singapore itself, it's a very high-income country with a very sophisticated consumer taste, but it's also very influential upon other Asian elites. So not only Singapore, but Japan and South Korea, they also play this role. So oftentimes when we think about the Chinese market, which is really big in size, the elites in China, they are very influenced by the consumption patterns of economies like Singapore, like Japan, like South Korea. So I think this is another aspect that could be highlighted. Brazil has a big difficulty to, first of all, establish global brands, and second, making these global brands be known, especially in Asia, right? Asia is geographically very far. We don't get a lot of tourists from Asia here in Brazil as much as we could get, and that also makes it that they don't get in touch with brands that maybe in the US or Europe we are also more familiar with. So even when we don't talk necessarily about the agro-industry, but thinking about cosmetics and thinking about the design and textile and shoe industries of Brazil, they all could be appealing to Singapore as a sophisticated market. But then on my other reasoning, I think the fact that Singapore is such an important trade route, maritime trade route, but also its airport working as an important hub, should also make us think about the value addition that sustainable aviation fuels and sustainable maritime fuels could play in increasing a more value-added Brazilian export of agricultural products. So we could think about methanol, for instance, for sustainable maritime fuels, but we could also encourage further trade with sustainable aviation fuels. However, we have an issue here in Brazil, which is the fact that we have to produce these fuels. And then I get to my other point, which is we should encourage investments from Singapore, from Singaporean funds, in increasing this export potential for agriculture goods that have to do with the energy sector. So not only agriculture as a food product, but for us to encourage the development of the methanol industry, for instance, we will need resources for plants to be established. So we have a few cases. More recently, we had one case that was announced in Pernambuco from Danish company European Energy. And similar examples could be established with the help of Singaporean funds. So I think trade and foreign direct investment, they will need to be connected for Brazil to truly benefit from the trade agreement once it is implemented. So it is about trade, but it's much more than that, and investment, foreign direct investment will need to come first. One last point about that is that Brazil currently has a goal to recover degraded areas. And degraded areas in Brazil mean something different than they mean in Asia, because the level of degradation in some Asian countries like China is very bad. In Brazil, it's not that much the case, but one of the examples where Singaporean funds could be looking into in terms of agriculture that will create trade is the recovery of degraded lands, because these lands, they can be recovered both for the production of food items like grains or things like that, but they could also, these grains could be used for the production of methanol, for instance, like to advance in the production chain and get to the point of producing sustainable fuels, both maritime and aviation fuels.
Very good, really interesting. Now, Ambassador Rubens Barbosa, with all your experience in United States and London, We have to acknowledge that you are living in a geopolitical world, right? How you see more or less this agreement, Singapore in this playing in this Brazil and Singapore, the agreement, all this divided world of geopolitics between the United States and China, please.
Well, I was going to mention this. You have to read the agreement in a broader context. How it fits in the new Brazilian place in the world.
Please, near the microphone, pertinho.
As we know, Asia in the last 15 years became the most important market for our products. And over 50% of Brazilian exports goes to Asia. 37% of ag products go to one country, China. So the agreement with Singapore has to be seen in this broader context. Brazil is opening markets in Asia. Bangladesh, Singapore, Vietnam have larger trade with Brazil than several European countries. So this is the reality. So I see the agreement between Brazil and Singapore in this context. The bilateral trade is not very high and won't be very high, around $10 billion, 80% of Brazilian exports. So from the Brazilian point of view, this agreement may be seen as an opportunity for exports from Brazil to Singapore to be distributed in Asia, as a hub, like Amsterdam is for Europe, the same thing. So from the Brazilian point of view, as far as trade is concerned, the agreement may fill this opportunity. From the Singapore point of view, trade is not important, as the minister has mentioned. The opportunities for Singapore and Brazil, as we mentioned, and I agree, and Larissa mentioned as well, is investment. I think that the areas that Larissa mentioned are important. I would add one or two. And I think that this could be useful for decision makers in Singapore, because if you have the Brazilian market and the South American market, you have 400 million people market. So to invest in areas that Brazil will need, will be looking for partners, like in ag products, like Larissa mentioned. And the other area that I see huge potential because of the changes that are taking place in the world economy and the international relations is minerals. Brazil has a large reserve of minerals, strategic minerals, rare earth, lithium, cobalt, I mean, the whole lot. And now Brazil is being looked at as a source of supply of minerals for the developed world. But I think that Brazil will develop a capacity to attract investment, to produce what is needed abroad, instead of sending, like in agriculture, the commodities without any transformation. Minerals could be transformed here instead of exporting lithium, cobalt to produce batteries here. with foreign investment. So the minister mentioned innovation, technology, and financial system products. These are important. But I think that the greatest potential is in these new areas, in agriculture and the minerals. Association of Singapore companies with Brazilian Singapore's to produce here these new products that are demanded worldwide. It will be a huge opportunity for Singapore companies and Singapore investors. So I think that the agreement is important both for Singapore and for Brazil, not for trade reasons. It's a trade agreement, you know, but the world is changing, you know, and as it was mentioned, the fact that we signed this agreement shows the interest of both countries to develop relationship. But in the world that we are living in today, Singapore and Brazil have other interests, and I think that the opportunities for both countries are enormous for different reasons and different priorities. And I think it's a good opportunity, and we should ask the Congress, the Brazilian Congress, to ratify the agreement as soon as possible and to stimulate Brazilian companies going. I see in the numbers that Brazil has investment in Singapore as well, like Singapore has already investment in Brazil. So I think that is a very promising opportunity for both countries.
Thank you, Ambassador. I fully agree with you. It's much more than trade. Now again to Ambassador Luciano. How do you see that we are going to arrive in Singapore with something new? You have an agreement in your hands, right? How do you think this can open the door for Brazil signing and negotiating agreements with other countries in the region? Because as you know, Brazil is very reluctant in signing agreements. And I think that in this world that I call the geo-economic world, we need more agreements than ever, right? Ambassador Luciano, how you see this first step?
Thank you, Vera. Well, I think every negotiation has its own history and challenges. And as Mr. Tan has emphasized, I think we're talking about a region that is very dynamic but very diverse. And so every specific country has its own economic structure, social structure, and that's, of course, something that comes into play when you're negotiating with a specific country. But yes, I think the agreement with Singapore shows an effort by Brazil and Mercosul of, let's say, somehow catching up with the reality, because the world is changing, has changed to Asia. I've seen the ministry, our minister has traveled to Southeast Asia and to Asia in general several times over this more than a year and a half of the current administration, many times. So I think there's a clear focus and effort to prioritize Brazil's relations with the region. And I think it's important, as has been mentioned by Minister Tan, to look into the relations of Brazil and Singapore also with a regional focus, and to see how the agreement with Singapore can work strengthening this tradition that Singapore has as being a hub that has reinvented itself, was a hub of trade, a hub of services, a hub of finance, a hub of science, technology, innovation, a hub of digital economy. And I think that's something that Brazilian companies are already making use of. As you know, the main Brazilian multinationals have already regional offices in Singapore, and I'm sure they're looking into how they can make sure they can fully benefit from this agreement, and other companies can come to Singapore and to benefit from this agreement as well. I think that we have some stages to follow now in relation to the agreement with Singapore. As Ambassador has mentioned, first, I think we have to work very hard to make sure this agreement comes into force quickly. As you know, in the case of Brazil, it has its challenges, and I think it would be important to build our constituencies in Brazil that are in favor of this agreement, and I don't see a lot of people that would be against the agreement, but it's important to make this work and make sure that we can show Congress, well, this is important, this agreement is important, we should move fast. And it's possible to move fast, but that requires some effort. On a more technical level, I think it would be important to, in preparation for the entry into force of the agreement, to fully understand what is in there in areas like rule of origin, specific TBT, SPS rules, to see how these rules can interplay with the agreements that Singapore already has with its regional partners. And to see how, because I think in theory say, okay, this will help, okay, Singapore is really a hub, we want to re-export to other countries. This is already happening, as you know. I mean, you talk about the exports, I don't have the last figures, but first semester, Singapore was our 6th main export destination. That's very impressive. It's really very impressive. Although we have an important concentration on oil and oil-derived products, even so, I think it's very impressive. So it's clear that many companies are already making use of Singapore as a base to export to the region and to Asia in general. But I think with the agreement in force, the rules of the game change. It's important to see how you can make better use of those rules. And I think to see how they interact with the agreements Singapore already has with its partners is something that will be very important. So I think there's a fine-tuning in terms of analysis that we should carry out now that will be important in preparation for the entry into force of this agreement. So that's an element that I want to bring. And yes, and I hope that the Singapore agreement will be a showcase to future negotiations. And I'm sure other important agreements will come soon in Brazil and the region. Thank you.
Let's hope so. Larissa, let's explore a little bit your knowledge on agriculture in the forest areas, right? That is, you are living in a world that the carbon market is becoming an issue. It's not a big issue yet in Brazil. We don't have regulations to put it to work in the faster way. But I think it's important to take a view on this. Larissa, how your expectation? How Brazil can use the reality of having a huge extension of land to bring more opportunities for the Singaporean investors in Brazil in this area, or carbon? How you see the market of carbon?
Thank you. I think that's a very interesting point and perspective to be analyzed, although, as you mentioned, the regulation is not fully in place. But we know Singapore is an important market for carbon trading decisions, so this is very positive. And I think there is a growing understanding in Brazil, even in the Brazilian agriculture sector, that there need to be ways to create direct benefit for producers, for them to engage in collaborative ways to use agriculture in all its potential to sequestrate carbon. So I think going back to my point of the recovery of degraded lands in Brazil, we're normally talking about degraded pasture lands that whose productivity could be improved, but not only pasture lands. Like it could be other areas in biomes that don't really work with pasture lands yet. But if you can think about increasing the agricultural production, using these areas in ways that necessarily the product will be deforestation free because the area is degraded, and it is degraded because trees were taken down in the past, so there is no deforestation issue. But you can also do that in a way of increasing monitoring and traceability, which is another item that would be very necessary for any products to claim access to the carbon markets. And at the same time, improve through technology the means of really understanding and monitoring how these emissions could be measured and monitored and be transformed into direct benefits to producers, be it through the way of introducing them to the carbon market directly, or maybe with investors that could finance this transformation and eventually offer financing lines to producers at this, who are the final people to implement the policies, offer them financing lines that are more competitive, that are cheaper, and that will actually encourage them to join the effort. So it's not clear in Brazil from a regulatory perspective how the agriculture sector will participate in the carbon market, but we all know that the potential is huge. But I think going back to a point that both ambassadors raised, it is very important for Singapore to consider ways of helping add value to these production chains for the agreement to also be considered interesting for the different parts of Brazilian society that would help push Congress into really saying yes to the agreement. Like, different parts of society would need to be convinced, and of course, the agriculture sector is normally the one that is more competitive, so they're more keen to join efforts. But Brazil also doesn't want to be forever a cheap commodity exporter, right? Even in agricultural goods. So we have to think about ways to add value to this agricultural potential through other means and with the help of investors. So I really think that fuels is a good way of looking into that. In general, low-carbon agricultural products are a good way of looking into that. We have enough technology to produce low-carbon beef, for instance. And with the per capita income of Singapore, I'm sure people are also increasing their knowledge of environmental issues, and there could be a market for premium products that are based on low-carbon agriculture. So I think we have to find these ways of adding value to production chains that are already obvious for this trade and that would benefit from an agreement. And these sectors of society, they would be partners in pushing the agreement forward.
Very well, Larissa. I really enjoyed this. Ambassador Rubens, you are writing a lot about the new possibility that Brazil sign or not sign or will approach the new initiative of Belt and Road. And how this kind of things, I think this probably will help more the relationship of Singapore with Latin America. You can see by the numbers, that's a huge amount, the growth of imports of Latin America from all the region is growing, more industrial goods, right? So in my question will be how you see how this will impact the relation of South America. You are talking about the big Chennai port in Peru, right? That you put, it will be inaugurated probably the end of the year. So this open opportunity for the Pacific directly. So how you see this kind of initiatives, how they can strengthen the relationship also of Brazil and Singapore? You know, seeing from Brazil is an Atlantic country. Now you are being forced to look at the other side of the global map. How you see this happening?
Well, you know, diplomats like to think strategically, you know, thinking ahead of time to see the alternatives And for me, at least, it's very difficult to understand how, after 15 years in which Asia became the leading trading partner to Brazil, we have to export to China and to Asian countries through the Panama Canal or the south of Africa. It's difficult for me to understand how the lack of a strategic thinking, because if 50% of our trade goes to Asia, it would be normal to think how we could reach Asia through a Pacific port.
Acho que é o seu telefone.
É o meu?
Não é? Não é o da Larissa?
Não é o meu, não.
Não é o Larissa, não é o meu?
É o dela.
Ah,
So it's very difficult for me to understand how we could bear this situation. Now, we know that Xi Jinping is coming to South America, to Brazil, for the G20 meeting, and will pass through Peru to inaugurate a port in which they invested $400 million. And this port will be a hub in the South American Pacific countries, no? Chile, Colombia, Peru will go through coastal transportation. And all the trade from China to South America will be through this port. Now, Brazil is beginning to think how to connect roads, waterways to Peru, to the Shanghai port. The other day I received an information, a paper from a Peruvian friend. They are already thinking. They have already devised ways and means to communicate waterways in Brazil and roads in Brazil to the port through waterways and roads in Peru. And this will help a lot the agricultural products that goes through Asia. Now, agricultural products will have to go to the Atlantic to go to China. So I think that the idea of Brazil joining a Belt and Road Initiative, which, as I understand, is on the table, would be good for Brazil if we could dissociate the Chinese philosophy of the project, because Brazil has a bilateral mixed commission with China called COSBAN, and they centralize all the discussions in all areas of common interest. And I think that if we join the Belt and Road Initiative is being dealt with in this joint commission from the global point of view, from the geopolitical point of view, it would be very difficult for any Western countries to say, wow, this is dangerous. But I think if, and I understand that there are concern in Brasilia about this possibility, because as we are looking what is happening in the world, we will have in the coming years and decades a divided world, and a Western world and an anti-Western world. And in my view, Brazil should do what India is doing. India, in my view, is the country with the best foreign policy adjusted to what is happening today. India is not taking sides. They have presence in all sides, in the Western side and in the anti-Western side. Geopolitically, they have the best foreign policy according to their interest. We are living in a moment in the world where countries decided, not according, in my view, not according with the ideology, with the principles, they decided according their own interest. Either we look into our own interest, not as someone in the States said many years ago, countries don't have friends, they have interests. And this is very present. No? Countries today don't have friends, they have interests. They can join one side in one time, another side the other time, and Brazil should do the same. And that's why I think this agreement and this rapprochement with Singapore is important, because it is the first agreement with Asia. So it's Brazil is too big, looks inward, you know, and we have to start looking outwards. And probably other agreements with Indonesia, with Vietnam. I understand that there are conversations with Vietnam, with other Asian countries. I hope that this goes forward. But Singapore was the first, and I think that Singapore has to take advantage of this, and Brazil as well. Brazil has to look seriously into this possibility of the Belt and Road Initiative, provided that we have our own interests on the table. I happened to be on the table when a vice prime minister, Chinese prime minister, proposed this strategic partnership with Brazil. I was present. Cardoso was the foreign minister. We had a meeting with them. And the Chinese, after studying 10, 15 years what Brazil could do for them, proposed this strategic partnership. We are very pleased, but until today, we don't have a strategic definition about China. We have to define that, and perhaps the Belt and Road Initiative could be an opportunity for us to define a strategic partnership that goes through physical integration in the region. This is a point that Brazil is lacking as well. We don't have a larger trade with South American countries because among other reasons, we don't have a physical integration in the region. And if the Chinese are prepared to finance some infrastructure projects linking Brazil to Asia, why not to examine?
It'll be a new beginning. Minister, you certainly now you know how important is this agreement and how it's the first Brazil and how we are going to start changing a little bit our knowledge of what's going on in Asia, right? I'd like to, we have some minutes more, and I'd like to open the floor if you want to make any questions. If not, no, we can have a coffee together. Yes, Professor. Ornelas, it's a pleasure. Please come in. Professor Ornella is a very well-known professor in international trade. So,
thank you. Well, I just first want to thank Lucas for organizing this very interesting event. Mr. Tan for the short but fascinating summary about the Singaporean miracle, which is really fascinating, and the panel for the discussion. One question about the agreement. Many of you mentioned other issues like investment, even geopolitics, etc. All this is I understand that well. But you also mentioned, and Larissa in particular mentioned, like, you know, possibilities for the agro industry, the Brazilian agro industry exporting more to Singapore. But Singapore, as I often mention to my undergrad students, is famous for being, you know, one of the very few countries that follow essentially a free trade policy in almost all products. So thinking in particular about the, you know, the agro industry export opportunities to Singapore, how does market access to the Singaporean market change with the agreement, given that they were already following a, you know, almost free trade policy in general? Thanks.
I guess the question is for me, right? Yeah. Yeah, I think it's a point that would have to really look into the details of the different supply chains. But I do think that Brazilian agri-industry players, especially the ones that are not animal protein, right? Because the sector of animal protein has multinational companies that are present throughout the world. But when we think about the other items, normally people don't think about Asia as a market that they should aim at. And I think e-commerce could also play a very interesting role on that regard, because we are, when you think about diversifying the supply of products, a lot of these products will be niche products. You're not going to make billions exporting these products, but they can make a huge difference in the areas where they are produced, and only for that sake, it is already worth the effort. But I think the item of e-commerce is also very important, so that Brazilian industries in general start paying more attention to the potential of trying to put their products in Asia and using Singapore as a platform for that. So in practical terms, we would have to analyze the different industries and whether they do face some tariffs when they have more value added arriving in Singapore, which is usually the case, right? But I think most of all is the fact that we should raise awareness about the topic of further engaging with Asia, and that more companies and more industries could participate in this process. And it is not only something that JBF, BRF, Marfrig, Minerva, like the big players can do. It is something that acai producers can do. It is something that technically, like dairy producers, they should be able to add value to their production and create new products that could be exported to these Asian markets, like our companies that produce from cakes and all sorts of sweet things should be looking into that market. Our wine industry, the cachaça industry, all of those are sectors that some of them have a bit more exposure to Asia, but in general I don't think they take Asia as a market destination. And I think this could help raise their attention to the region as a whole.
Ambassador?
Just to add something, I was having a look at my resume of the agreement. And there's, as Larissa said, I think if you go into the details, the question is, with Singapore, the agreement comes, it's agreement with a country that is very open. That's the case of Singapore. So we don't have a lot of barriers that are, let's say, official barriers in this area. And we have a very constructive and positive dialogue between our sanitary and phytosanitary authorities. So, for instance, we have an agriculture attaché in our embassy there in Singapore. The attaché is changing now. More or less, we arrive more or less at the same time. And I was talking to him before going and said, look, Luciano, there's no big deal. There's no big problem. Singapore has recognized our system in ways. Most of our export industry and agriculture have access to the Singaporean market. So I think we have this challenge of diversifying and adding value. And there are ways to add value in agriculture, as Larissa has mentioned. a point I want to refer to, I think it relates to what Larissa has just said. For instance, one that was one of the sticking points to get to the, it was not one of the main ones, but until the end, we had a discussion about geographic indications, for instance. And the point that Brazil was pushing a little bit was about geographic indications for coffee. And that was perhaps one of the little areas in my previous job that I covered as intellectual property. And then to look, perhaps it's we don't know if it will be really important or not, but it's a way of adding value. Because if you want to make sure you can put some specific produce in the Singaporean market, it's be important to recognize geographic indication for coffee, for instance, because you can add value, you can build a brand in this area, for instance. You mentioned cachaça, and there are others. I think we will have to step up this effort, and probably there's some homework to do as well in terms of how we can place products of higher value, build brands, and make sure we can fully benefit from this agreement. One point that I want to mention, looking at my resume, something that apparently will improve with this agreement is the system of pre-listing of establishments. And so what means that makes easier to a Brazilian company to export to the Singapore market without too much bureaucracy. It will be easier to recognize a Brazilian company that will be able to be allowed to export, making sure that it fulfills all the requisite requirements to make this. That's something positive. That's something that adds to this effort of diversifying, because you probably will have more companies in a position to export to the Singapore market. So.
Yes, another one, please.
Test.
Sorry, a quick question and without much protocol. First, my name is Enrique O'Reilly, and I represent a fintech base in Singapore that is looking to open up here in Brazil. So the question is, what is this free trade agreement proposal or double taxation that maybe we could have helping companies that want to sell software into Brazil, to import software in terms of licensing the product, as well as repatriating profits back into Singapore? Is there any provision that will help us to do that more efficiently?
Well, if I can use my knowledge of
yes, please.
A professor.
It's a service thing.
Look, service area, perhaps Lucas can help you also. In service area is quite broad, the agreement, as far as I remember. So this will help you because there's no big barrier. You are just selling products. You are not, are you going to establish here, or you are going to provide, you are going to supply service in Brazil? No, you are just being using the agreement as an open gate to export and import service. I don't think that you are going to have any problem with, and I think that agreement will help you in this way, right?
But I think that points to an aspect that I think is important in preparation for the entry into force of the agreements, to really make an effort to spread the word, to inform about the agreement. For instance, we are not being able to give the details of, oh, this is precisely covered or not in which elements. That's something that I think we both sides will have to work hard in that direction. The agreement is public. It's easy to access the full text of the agreement. But when you go into the details, sometimes there are technicalities that must be understood, must be explained. And I think it would be important to every sector, every different stakeholder to understand the agreement and say, yes, this is going to work for me. Well, this is not really for me, but yes, it will help somehow, more directly, less directly. But I think that's the work we have to do together in this stage in preparation for the entry into force of the agreement.
Good. But I think for service, sure, Minister, please.
Just to build on, I think, Professor's question. So if you think about the trade aspect, Singapore is already a free trade port. It's already open. We only have tariffs on, I think, 6 items. I think that's alcoholic. We don't want to get too happy. But almost immediately if it's enforced, then you would be able to expedite the customs clearance for express shipment, for example. So I think currently it's about 48 hours, goes down to about 6 hours. So this is just very practical. Second, I think because Brazil agricultural products, it also helps to put your agricultural products on a fast lane, particularly for perishable goods, your milk and dairy and the likes. So these are small incremental ones, but I think if you look at it, going into Singapore and then having Singapore go as a base for the broader region, which I think what Ambassador is saying, I think that's really, really important. Then to Enrique also, there is an avoidance for double taxation agreement. And I think with the free trade agreement in place, there'll also be a lot of lawyers that are going to have a lot of good jobs. They will help you to activate and also make use of it as best as possible, either the sale of digital goods, which Money Thor is doing, or in the sale and trade of physical goods and agri-food, agricultural products. The last point I wanted to make is also that there is also inherent advantages in Singapore. It's not just I think the panel mentioned the efficient ports, but also logistics infrastructure. Those make sure that your goods can move very quickly, they move safely, and they go to the destination which they are meant to go to. And then there's also the financial aspect, so there's basically trade supporting infrastructure, which is very important. Singapore is a financial center. I mentioned a little bit about the startup ecosystem, but actually the wholesale trade as well as financing of trade there is a huge ecosystem there. So I think those are just natural, not natural advantages, but created advantages for, yes. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for allowing me to.
It was a pleasure. Now, Professor Lucas Ferraz to give us the last words. I think it was a very good exchange of views, and we learned a lot, Minister.
So thank you all for coming today. It's really a great pleasure to have you all here. It's an honor, actually. And I think we all agreed that there is a great potential for strengthening bilateral trade relations between Brazil, Mercosul, and Singapore, and Asia as a whole, using this agreement as a strategic platform for that. So thank you all again. And I would like to invite the Minister for a beautiful picture with the participants of the panel. And again, thank you very much, Ambassador Luciano, Ambassador Rubens Barbosa, and Larissa for these very fruitful discussions today. Thank you.